Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is Monday, April 1st. Happy April Fool's Day. And today we are going to be talking all kinds of basketball. We are going to be starting in the NCAA tournament where we had the last set of Sweet 16 games take place since the last time we held this show, as well as all of the Elite 8 matchups, so we will be diving into all of those with some recaps. Then we are going to be talking about Joel Embiid and the fact that he is possibly set to return from injury this week. Adrian Wojnarowski put out a story that he might return tomorrow night against the Thunder, so we'll dive into that. And then in the latter half of the show, we will be talking about the biggest NBA games from this past weekend before finally setting up a final segment where we're just going to be looking at the playoff picture and putting together the best possible NBA playoffs based off of some conceivable seeding options going forward here in the final weeks of the regular season. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers to use the comment section, as well as our post-live viewers as well. We always read the comments on our videos, so let us know what you think about what we are talking about in the latest happenings in sports. And if you would consider donating, leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. Getting into our first segment of the day, we're going to be talking some college basketball. So, like I mentioned, we did have some brief Sweet 16. We had some Sweet 16 games on Friday that we did not get to cover, so I'm going to briefly go over those before spending some more time in depth on the Elite 8 matchups. So, looking at Friday's games, Purdue pulled away from Gonzaga in the second half to win that one. It is just another example, this game was, of you can compete with Purdue for a while, but it is just so hard to keep your best interior defenders on the court through the entirety of the game when you're playing against Zach Edey. Graham Ike and Anton Watson both fouled out for Gonzaga, and they just were not able to keep pace with Purdue in this one. I'm not quite as upset about some of the calls that Zach Edey gets that other people do, but I do understand it's not the most aesthetically appealing game of basketball to watch when it is Edey going to the free throw line and the best players on the other team not being able to play due to foul trouble. But 7-4 in college is just so hard to defend, and obviously other teams are sort of feeling that this postseason. So they advanced to play Tennessee, who won a close game against Creighton. Dalton Knecht continued to sort of struggle with his efficiency, but led the way for the Volunteers with 26 points in that game. The key stat was the fact that Tennessee only turned the ball over 4 times and grabbed 12 offensive rebounds. So Creighton just let them have far more opportunities than they did offensively, and that really hurt them. Also, the fact that we saw Creighton struggle with having some depth throughout the course of the season. Their starting lineup was very well-rounded. We saw that in a game such as Oregon in the second round, but ultimately Trey Alexander didn't really have his best stuff in this game, and the Creighton team just didn't have a bench to really supplement that. In the South region, we had a couple upsets with Duke over Houston and NC State over Marquette. I do firmly believe that if Jamal Shead didn't get injured, Houston wins that game. It also didn't help that Juwan Roberts went out for the Cougars as well. So, I mean, credit to Duke for winning a low-scoring game. Their defense had been very impressive through the NCAA tournament run there, but they end up just sort of coming away with... They caught a break, really, is what it came down to with some of the injuries that took place for Houston. And then Marquette couldn't buy a three-pointer in their game against NC State. They went 4 of 31. Only 2 players hit a 3 for them in Tyler Kolek and Cam Jones. They took 60 shots as a whole, and they took 31 3-pointers, meaning that over 50% of their looks were threes, and they shot just under 13% on them. So really rough stuff there. Credit NC State's defense some, but Marquette did also get a lot of open looks in this game and definitely led to a disappointing loss where I was shocked to see that Tyler Kolek only had 3 assists in this game because he did create a lot of opportunities for his teammates, and ultimately Marquette finally was able to break into the Sweet 16, but their run ended there. Now, getting on to the Elite 8 games, we saw on Saturday night one of the craziest runs in the game of basketball with the UConn and Illinois game. The score was 23-23 with just about a minute and a half left in the first half, and UConn then responded with a 30-0 run into the second half for this to take place in an Elite 8 game against a very good Illinois team, obviously conference champions, one of the top tier offenses in the country. They were ranked the number 2 offense coming into this game, and it's just unbelievable to show how dominant UConn has been during this run. They end up winning the game, the Huskies do, 77-52. This was probably the most dominant game of Donovan Clingan's college career, at least that I've seen. I know that he scored 29 against New Hampshire earlier this year, but I don't really count that one as much. I've been sort of so-so on Clingan as an NBA prospect, but this was just an unbelievable performance from him where he scores 22 points, grabs 10 rebounds, and blocks 5 shots. In the 22 minutes that he played, Illinois only scored 14 points. He completely locked down the paint. I don't really know why the Illinois were trying him as much as they were in the post in this game, but Clingan had it locked down, and in doing so, completely eliminated Terrence Shannon Jr. from this matchup. Shannon scored just 8 points on 2 of 12 from the field. This is the least amount of points scored by him all season long, so that was great to see from Clingan. This was supposed to be a matchup between the 2 best offenses in the country, but instead Illinois only puts up 52. And for good reason, we see UConn being the betting favorite to win it all, and it's for good reason. They have led by at least 30 points in every tournament game they've played up to this point, which is just ridiculous. And in this game, they didn't even really have the 3 ball behind them. They matched the Illinois team here in terms of points by just their points in the paint. They score 52 in the paint. Illinois scores 52 in the game as a whole. UConn was just 3 of 17 from 3, and they were able to win by 25 points. Just ridiculous stuff for them. They had more team assists than Illinois had made field goals in the game as a whole. So, again, this UConn team has the potential to really be an all-timer. We talked about this on Friday. There's already the argument that they're better than the championship team from last season, and they really have a chance to solidify themselves as, I do think, one of the best teams possibly in at least recent tournament history. But this 2-year run here has been incredible from Dan Hurley and the Huskies. The game of the weekend in college basketball was probably Alabama over Clemson. That also took place on Saturday night. The Crimson Tide come away 89-82. Both of these programs were looking for the first Final Four appearance in their program's history, and ultimately it's Alabama that comes away with this one. It was a 35-32 ball game at halftime. Pretty low scoring for an Alabama matchup. Alabama had missed 12 of their first 13 three-point attempts, which was a very good sign for a Clemson team who really rallied behind their defense and opposing teams missing their threes through their first few wins in the NCAA tournament. Opponents were just 14 of 75 from three headed into this game for Clemson, but both teams' offenses exploded in the second half, with each of them scoring 50 plus points. And when you allow yourself to get into a shootout with this Alabama team, things typically aren't going to work out for you. Down the stretch, it was the two teams exchanging threes, which, again, a very dangerous game to play when you're going up against Alabama. And ultimately, the better offense came out of this one, led by Mark Sears, who was incredible down the stretch in this one. He went 6 of 7 from three in the second half, really sparked the offensive takeover in this one. Jaron Stevenson came off the bench as well. He had a little bit of a shaky start, but he ends up scoring a career-high 19 points and knocks down 5 three-pointers as well. So Bama went from going 1 of 13 from three in the first half to then going 16 of 36, hitting 15 of their last 23 attempts, which is just a ridiculous mark for them, but also at the same time isn't too out of character for what this Alabama team has done as of late. I know that I haven't been the highest on them because of their defense, but again, their offense is just so dangerous, and it's showed through this run that, you know, they are scary enough to put up a fight against any type of team, and I felt like they sort of pulled Clemson into their style of game, which was beneficial for them. And ultimately, they are moving on for their first Final Four appearance. We'll see what happens against UConn. I don't want to dive into that matchup all too much just yet, but on the other side of the bracket, we had Tennessee pushing Purdue for the Boilermakers' closest game of the tournament, the only 1-versus-2 matchup that reached the Elite Eight, and Purdue ultimately came out on top 72-66. This was a game of two of the Naismith Player of the Year finalists facing off, and both of them showed up, where Zach Edey and Dalton Knecht both put on a show. Edey came out on top of this matchup, scoring 40 points, a career high for him. Knecht accounted for 37 on the Tennessee side of this game. This was the first time in NCAA tournament history that both teams had a single player score at least half of their points, the team's total points. There were only 3 players who hit double digits in this game. It was Edey, Knecht, and Fletcher Lawyer added an additional 14 points for Purdue. You can look at the box score for Knecht and point to the fact that he took 31 shots, very high volume. And if you didn't watch the game, you might try and point the finger at him, but ultimately Tennessee was just unable to get anything else going offensively, and Knecht really was just putting the team on his shoulders, trying to do the heavy lifting, and just nobody else could get it going for them. The rest of the team was just 10 of 31 from the field, and ultimately that is sort of why they lost this game, along with the fact that nobody could guard Zach Edey. The Volunteers tried to throw out a handful of different looks for them. They had Toby Awaka come off the bench, and they were hoping that he could be the big-time defender, but he was only able to play 14 minutes, and because of foul trouble, which he did late in the fourth. I thought that JP Estrella, not the biggest guy necessarily, not the one that you expected, but he's actually 6'11". He just looked so much smaller on the court behind Edey, but who doesn't really? But the freshman came out. I thought he played just about the best defense as anybody did against Edey in this game. But that's also not saying all too much, with Edey finishing with 40 points and 16 rebounds. He also had the block against Knecht with 34 seconds left in the game to end up sealing that one. A lot of people were upset with the fact that Edey shot 22 free throws, which was double the amount that Tennessee shot in the game. Again, it's extremely difficult to officiate a player like Edey. I know that a lot of people make the argument that they just don't officiate Edey, and that's the reason why he gets away with it. A lot of people call for he fouls offensively a lot more than the refs ever credit him for, and he gets a foul call every time he's on defense. Honestly, I'm not really here to dispute that necessarily. You do have to understand that at his size, obviously he's going to get fouled more than anybody else in the college basketball atmosphere. It just, it makes sense to me. Free throw discrepancy isn't, this phenomenon that happens. There's a reason behind it, and it's because of the fact that Edey spends as much time as he does in the post. And, when you put up that many shots, obviously it's so difficult to guard him at that size, in the college basketball atmosphere, that more times than not, you're going to end up fouling. And I understand it's not, super appealing to watch, but again, I don't really feel like diving into whether or not the refs need to change how they officiate Edey. It just sort of is what it is, and ultimately, Tennessee had a chance in this game if they had other guys show up on offense, and sort of the opposite of what happened in the UConn-Illinois game. I thought that Tennessee should have tried to attack Edey more than they did. We saw Connect sort of operating the pick and roll a little bit, helped him get to some of his spots in the mid-range that went down, but there's definitely a difference between Kling in the post defensively and Edey, where, yes, I mentioned that Edey had that block in crunch time that was massive for them, but I do think he's a lot more gettable than Klingon is, and ultimately, when you look at Purdue here, this is a very nice redemption story for as much as of the negativity that they get. Almost the fact that they had suffered all of these upsets in the past has additionally had people to call them fraudulent, and then they don't play maybe the most appealing brand of basketball to a lot of basketball fans. But at the same time, I mean, they are incredible for as dominant as obviously UConn has been up to this point. Purdue has been just around that same level of dominant up to this point. Tennessee ultimately pushes them far. If they were in a different region here, I think there's a very solid chance they end up coming out. But Purdue was a very tough draw for them, and ultimately it is Purdue moving on to the program's first Final Four since 1980, where they will be facing NC State, who pulled off the upset against Duke. The legend of DJ Burns lives on. 29 points for him in this game. Really controlled the pace, the slowing the game down, posting up, forcing the extra attention on himself, and when they didn't, he took advantage of the looks that Duke was giving him. Ultimately, he was able to carry them in this one. DJ Horn also built off a very strong performance versus Marquette. Scored another 20 in this game. Felt like he started out pretty slow, and both offenses did when it was a 27-21 Duke lead at halftime, but he got it going from there and really helped spark the NC State offense as a whole push in the second half, where they outscored Duke 55-37. They shot 73% from the field and did not miss consecutive field goal attempts in that second half. Meanwhile, Duke was held to just 32% from the field. NC State has now held their last 6 opponents to under 40% from the field. So really impressive defensive stuff there from State. Jared McCain was pretty much the only one that came to play offensively for the Blue Devils. He ends up scoring 32 points, which ties Zion for the most points scored by a freshman in the program's history during an NCAA tournament game. He now has 2 of the 3 highest scoring freshman performances in program history from that same aspect of an NCAA tournament game, where he had scored 30 versus JMU. So he has very likely worked himself into being a lottery pick later this summer. Meanwhile, Kyle Filipowski had another pretty disappointing outing. He and McCain are sort of trending in opposite directions here, where Filipowski could potentially be a lottery pick, but had a couple performances here as of late that could hurt him. Ultimately, it's important to remember that tournament games don't mean everything, but he was just 3 of 12 from the field, scored 11 points. He did grab 9 rebounds, but he also turned the ball over 3 times and fouled out, was not able to do a good enough job against Burns. Now, he averaged 16 points per game on 51% shooting during the regular season, so again, this was a little uncharacteristic, but just 11 points per game on 43% during March Madness. Not super encouraging from a big man, but all in all, a very solid season for Duke here, where they sort of flew under the radar and ultimately made the Elite Eight. Now, I don't think that their path to make it to this point in the tournament was really all that difficult, not to undermine what they did do, but they only beat one single-digit seed during their run, and that was a Houston team that lost their Naismith finalist player of the year. So, if he doesn't go down with injury, again, I think Houston wins that matchup. But NC State really is the story of this. You have to be positive about that, considering the fact that you look back and there are just so many inflection points during this NC State run where you have to look back at that Virginia game. Isaac McNeely, an 85% free throw shooter, going 0 for 2 from the line. Tony Bennett and Virginia deciding not to foul while they were up 3. And then Michael O'Connell hits the buzzer beater to force overtime. They come out of that, end up winning the ACC tournament, and now here they are in the Final Four. An extreme pleasure to watch them. Very well-rounded, and 9 straight wins for them, and they reached the Final Four for the first time since 1983. So we now have an NC State versus Purdue matchup, as well as an Alabama versus UConn matchup that is set to take place on Saturday. We will then have the championship game on Monday. So going to be a lot of fun to see, especially that DJ Burns versus Zach Edey matchup. 2 very different body types, of course. There was also a story that came out, and I'm going to have to look more into it after the show here, but supposedly NFL prospects are buzzing about DJ Burns. NFL, you heard that right, in terms of the size that he has. Now, again, going to have to look more into that, but you can check out the GSMC Sports Podcast channel. I'll have to do some more research and record a short later today, so stay tuned for that. But that is all we have on these matchups. Let me know what you guys think about these past college games and who you have going forward here. But for now, we are going to be taking our first break of the show. And when we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into the conversation around Joel Embiid and his imminent return from injury. So stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Elite Eight and all the matchups from this past weekend. Now we are going to be diving into some more NBA, as we just got news this morning from Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN about the fact that Joel Embiid is set to return from injury as soon as tomorrow night's game. So we're going to be diving into that conversation here. The story was put out this morning that it is looking like he is trying to ramp up for the playoffs, trying to get a handful of regular season games under his belt before the 76ers try and make a postseason push. Embiid last played on January 30th against the Warriors. Was a tough game. He was really laboring through it with a different knee injury through a lot of that game, and then ultimately went down with this left meniscus injury that led to him having to get surgery that happened in the fourth quarter, and it has kept him out since then. He got that surgery early in February. Headed into that January 30th game versus the Warriors, the 76ers were the 2 seed in the East at 32-16. Since then, they have gone 8 of 19 and are currently the 8 seed in the Eastern Conference playoffs. Seems like they are going to be fighting their way through the play-in tournament to come out of it. We'll see how this plays out, how soon that Embiid is able to return. As it currently stands, they are 2 games behind the Indiana Pacers for that 6th seed. They only have 7 games left in their season, so would take quite the run here. And ultimately, I think that more than anything, the seeding isn't the biggest concern for them. It's sort of, what does Joel Embiid look like? Because there is a lot of conversation surrounding whether or not the Sixers should bring Embiid back for a potential playoff push. So we'll get into sort of the thought process behind that, because Embiid is somebody who has obviously dealt with injuries through his entire career. It caused him to miss the whole first year after he was drafted a handful of years ago in the 2014 draft. He actually missed his first 2 seasons with a foot injury, and then even since then, it has been a massive conversation, is his injuries, whether it is the regular season games themselves, or it seems like every time the 76ers do miss the playoffs, or do make the playoffs, I should say, by the second round, he is dealing with some type of injury, and it's really inhibited his level of play to the point where he hasn't been the MVP caliber player that we see during the regular season, like we end up seeing the version of him in the playoffs. So that is a real concern, and there are some people who were sort of calling for Embiid to sit out the rest of this year, have the 76ers try and gear up and make a bigger run during next postseason, have him come in as healthy as possible. And I do feel like I was sort of along those lines. That's the direction I thought they should have gone with, but very shortly after Embiid went down with injury, we had the trade deadline. They end up making a couple solid moves, really, in adding Campaign and, more notably, Buddy Hield to their roster to try and beef up some of their other scoring options for as time comes here. And I do think when you talk about this conversation, the biggest thing is whether or not Joel Embiid wants to play, which it is clear that he does. And I do understand that injuries are such a big concern with him, and the fact that you want to ensure that he is staying healthy and he's not possibly hurting himself even more long term. But if he feels like he is ready to gear up for a playoff run, I do think it becomes very difficult for this Sixers organization to tell him no. The whole reason that Joel Embiid is known as the process is because of the fact that the 76ers spent years trying to bottom out in the standings and get as many lottery picks as possible. And he was ultimately the one piece that really hit from that era. So you have to trust the process. The process is getting Joel Embiid. So that's how, obviously, I'm sure you all know, that is the origin of it. But just to say that the fact that this is a team that was purposefully trying to lose, the process was losing, and then all of a sudden they get a guy like Embiid years later, and you get a guy like Ben Simmons, who of course was good for a stretch there, and immediately they just snapped their fingers and said, okay, well now it's time to win. But you've had this losing culture for all these years, and there have been some quotes from players in the past. I know that Evan Turner wasn't a long-term piece necessarily for Philly, but there have been former 76ers who really felt like their development was stunted because of the fact that they were trying to lose games, and that was just something that didn't click with the locker room, which is partially why you saw, along with some burner Twitters and such from their GM at the time, and you see him and their GM, their head coach, all sort of funnel out, and just tons of turnover in the organization as a whole, as opposed to just trying to maximize what you have. And I can't say that tanking never works. I do understand the reasoning for it, but ultimately now you look at all these years later, you have the reigning MVP, who was potentially going to be back-to-back MVPs if he had played enough games this season, was averaging 35 points per game earlier this year, along with his 11 rebounds and 5 assists as well. But to then say, no, we're actually not going to play you here, even though you think you can play, we're going to sit you down, get ready for next season, try and get into the lottery, add something else there, But that is a little bit of a tough sell, and it would require Daryl Morey, their GM, sitting down with Embiid and trying to lay out, okay, this is why it's better for you to not play the rest of this season. And keep in mind that Daryl Morey, we just had all of this drama with James Harden take place this past offseason that stretched into the beginning of the regular season, where he had promised James Harden this contract that was coming, and then ultimately he sort of switched up his thought process. He didn't give Harden the contract that Harden was expecting, and it just got very messy. And now you are expecting your other star player to sort of play out that similar role, which is just a bit of a risky move in my eyes, and it really has the potential to disrupt Embiid's willingness to stick around with Philly, where he was already dropping some hints during the offseason about the potential of him moving on somewhere else. Philly needs Embiid, and I understand that injuries are a big time concern, but he is currently in his age 29 season. He just turned 30 a couple weeks ago, and ultimately he is going to, if you're a 76ers team that believes that Embiid is good enough to be your centerpiece for a playoff run, you have other good players, an all-star in Tyrese Maxey, a solid role player in Tobias Harris, you just added a Buddy Hield, and you have all of these other pieces. Ultimately, I understand you can make the argument of, well, next year we'll be healthier, we're going to have this cap space, Paul George is supposedly being rumored to potentially end up in Philly. There's just sort of a lot of ifs there in the future, and do I think that they have a great chance to go on a playoff run this postseason? Not necessarily, but it's also, I think it's really harming to your organization if your best player wants to play. You are conceivably in a place where you can be a contender, having your MVP candidate star player healthy. Again, healthy is also sort of with an asterisk, because it's not like he's going to be fully healthy in theory this postseason, but you also don't know when he's ever going to be fully healthy. And if they can knock off the Celtics in round one, potentially. We'll sort of get into bigger playoff picture as the time comes, but if they were to take down a Celtics or a Bucks team in the first round, they can take down anybody, and that is going to be their biggest test. Honestly, it's probably better for them to have Embiid healthy for that first round series as opposed to trying to advance to the conference finals, which they haven't even done so yet up to this point with Joel Embiid reach the conference finals and have the risk of Embiid getting injured somewhere along the way. So ultimately, this whole conversation is a little bit irrelevant because of the fact that he is going to return. And if that is the case, well, what are their chances? And I don't think that they're necessarily great, but I do look specifically at that. Again, they could potentially make their way into a 6 seed. I don't think that that's going to happen. We will see. Again, Tuesday night, tomorrow night, as we are recording this, is the first game that he could potentially come back. Their schedule isn't terribly difficult down the stretch, where they're then going to be playing in Miami. So those are the 2 hardest games. And then they're against the Grizzlies, the Spurs, the Pistons, the Magic, which are a solid team, of course, and the Nets. So, maybe, but it would take a lot extra. Either way, I don't think that they're going to climb up into the 6th seed. I do think that they could have a potential chance against the Bucks in the first round if they got matched up there, where they would be coming off of maybe a little bit of momentum, beating the Miami Heat to get to the 7th seed, and then you have an Embiid versus Giannis matchup with Embiid being fully rested. The Bucks have been definitely up and down through the second half of the season. They've shown some highs, they've shown some ability to play defense, but I also still don't know whether or not, Embiid gives you a chance in any series, in theory at least, and some of the supporting pieces, like I would choose Tyrese Maxey over Damian Lillard right now if you're asking me to build a team together, but I even still think in a 7-game series, I'm probably going with Maxey because the way that Damian Lillard has played this season, and of course he's going to be a Hall of Famer, and he's incredible, and he's still good for dropping 40 points on any given night, but there's also a handful of games where we've seen him struggle with this efficiency, and maybe it's more of a year 2 thing with him and Giannis, but that 2-man game still really hasn't developed to the level that we were expecting it to up to this point. So I feel like the 76ers could potentially have a chance, and if you beat the Bucks, again, it's them and the Celtics are the top 2 seeds in the conference. The East has a lot of solid teams, but at the same time, I don't think that there's any world beaters necessarily in the conference that the 76ers would have no chance against. And again, I'm not the biggest Sixers fan. I don't know if I ever really see this nucleus ultimately winning a championship. But if you're the 76ers, you've made all of these moves because you do. So trying to hold Embiid back from this doesn't really make all that much sense, especially if you're trying to retain him as long as possible. Now, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe conversations could have steered a different way, and that you can find a lottery pick, you can get Paul George in the offseason, but that's just not the case. And from here on out, it's, judging the 76ers on what level of a contender they are. And I don't think they're a top-tier contender. I don't think that they are a true threat to the Boston Celtics. I think it's sort of the Celtics and everybody else in the Eastern Conference, but they're right there with anybody else when they are at the peak of their powers. So we will have to see with that. But on that note, we will keep you updated on when Embiid is set to return as the week goes on, but expect it to be this week. But on that note, we are going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back, we will be diving into the past weekend in the NBA. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our third segment of the day. We are going to be running through the biggest games and storylines from this past weekend in the NBA. I know that at this point in the season, the NBA can be a little bit dry at times with a bunch of teams no longer really trying if you're not in the top of the playoff hunt. If you're already eliminated, I should say, and even if they are trying, they're still not all that good. We're seeing a lot of upsets if you want to look at it from sort of a gambling perspective at that, but ultimately, a lot of these games can fall very dry, but we did have a handful of really interesting ones, including last night, so we will be getting into all of that, but I actually want to start with Friday night and the game between the Knicks and the Spurs. An incredible game, career games for their star players in Jalen Brunson and Victor Wembanyama. So wanted to dive into that. This ended up being an overtime game, and it was the Spurs coming out on top in this one over the Knicks. Final score was 130-126, and again, career highs for both Brunson and Wembanyama, who put up unreal numbers, with Jalen Brunson scoring a career-high 61 and Victor Wembanyama putting up 40 points, 20 rebounds, and 7 assists. And this just continues to be the development of Wemby. We've seen, of course, the conversations surrounding him in terms of whether or not he should be the Defensive Player of the Year. As the days go on, it does seem a little bit less likely, but at the same time, he's going to be an All-NBA defender, and really we're seeing with Wemby the offensive upside with him as well, where, if you do think from a traditional player development standpoint, Wemby is going to only get better from here, where he's averaging 21 points per game, 10.5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists. And, conceivably, he is going to be improving on that. And we're seeing some of these big-time outputs from him, including now this 40-point performance. It's really interesting because when you dive into some of the numbers surrounding where he gets his from specifically the three-point line, we've already seen, I guess briefly to touch on it, we've seen his acknowledgement of just being closer to the rim in general. His teammates, as they've developed at least a little bit more of an actual passing game, the Jeremy Sohan point guard minutes have been a thing of the past now, and his teammates are just being able to find him around the rim. There are these instances where sometimes he doesn't even need the ball passed to him, where if he has a smaller defender on him and he's looking for these mismatches anyways, he can just be near the rim in the paint and just redirect these shots. It almost looks like he's playing volleyball at times, where it's not even that he fully grabs the rebound and puts it back in. He just tips the ball in different ways and does this misdirection act that leads to free points for them. That it looks effortless, and it's so impressive from that standpoint. His understanding of the game and what type of a role he has. But along with that, part of the reason why he's such this generational prospect is in the fact that he has the perimeter game that he does. And he is currently shooting 32% from three. But what's interesting is if you look at the trends, he's actually a significantly better shooter when he is pulling up, stepping back, things of that nature, where he actually hasn't been that incredible in terms of just the catch and shoot game, which is something that obviously can become an absolute weapon for them as time goes on, where we see him be able to actually be a little bit more effective in the pick and pop game and things of that nature. His game just continues to develop, and it is so impressive from him that it's really encouraging to watch. It's tons of fun. Again, I've talked about this before. I am glad we're at this point with him where we can actually see him be on a team that is actually realistic in terms of being a watchable organization and a functional offense. And it's hard to find anything to sort of downplay how incredible he's been up to this point, and it's just so fun. But yeah, as I look here, Wemby's 3-point percentage on catch and shoots alone is 26.6, and yet his effective field goal percentage on catch and shoot is also still not great, and we're seeing him only get better as time goes on here. I think it's very entertaining to watch. In this one, we also had Vassell put together a very nice performance, and Keldon Johnson, who's now coming off of the bench for San Antonio, which I found to be interesting. He had a solid game as well. But I also do want to give Jalen Brunson his flowers a little bit for this performance, coming just 1 point shy of the Knicks franchise record. Melo had 62 a handful of years ago, and Brunson finishes this game with 61. And doing so on pretty solid efficiency, all things considered. 25 of 47. Yeah, 47 is a ton of shot attempts, but when you hit over 50% of them, you really can't complain. And he was the reason they were in that position in the first place, trying to overcome this historic rookie performance from Wemby, where he was the first rookie to have 40 and 20 since Shaquille O'Neal did it in 1993. And again, as we get into these final weeks, I do think that Brunson is only solidifying himself as a second-team All-NBA member this season, where he's just been able to help this Knicks team overcome so many injuries, from Randall dealing with the shoulder. We still don't really have a timeline yet on him. He's sitting at 46 games played at the moment. Playoffs are just a few weeks away. Not sure how much of him we're going to see. OG Anunoby has only played 17 games since they first traded for him, and he's been in and out of the lineup as well. Mitchell Robinson has played just over 20 games as well, only one since early December when he got injured. He did briefly make his return. I think he should be back for the playoffs as well, but they're not overwhelming him just yet at this point. So it's just been a very incredible stretch for Brunson, who's been putting up unbelievable numbers and keeping this Knicks team alive. It would have been easy for them to fall out of the picture, but Brunson has really won the heart of Knicks fans and the city as a whole, where he makes his first All-Star team. He's averaging 28 points per game with 6.5 assists. He's just been tremendous for them, and definitely want to give him his props, because without Brunson, the Knicks are obviously much further down in the standings. As it currently stands, they're 44 and 30 in the 4 seed. Again, this, with the injuries they had, this very easily could have become a lost season, but it's his individual play as well, but it does seem like he's just so beloved by his teammates and as a whole as well, that I really do think he helps elevate them to that next level. Maybe part of it is that Villanova relationship, where we've seen a much higher playing version of Dante DiVincenzo as of late. He's been terrific for them, as well as Josh Hart as well. So wanted to give him some credit on that. But I guess on that note, we can even stick with the Knicks, who also played a tremendous game last night against the Oklahoma City Thunder. They actually come out losing in this one as well, so they dropped their second straight game. Ultimately, again, not an overreaction by any means, but it was just a phenomenal game. Came down to the final seconds where the teams traded baskets in the final minute or so to end up being an Oklahoma City win in this one. And really it was Jalen Williams who was just so incredible for them in this game. His efficiency has been tremendous this year, and he did briefly miss some time, but in this one scored 33 points to lead the Thunder on 14 of 18 shooting. And there's also been a quote from the Ringer's Bill Simmons that has sort of been circulating this morning about how he sees some Kawhi Leonard in Jalen Williams. From some of the offensive, mannerisms, I can see that from the way that he just sort of drives his shoulders into defenders. He gets to his spot. He's a good finisher. It's not like he relies heavily on the dribble, although, you can make an argument, at least if we're looking at Kawhi from where he was in his second season, definitely an improved dribbler over Kawhi, and even still, it's more Kawhi using his size, I feel like, to get to his spots than it is necessarily his individual dribble package. I'm not sure if we're ever going to see Jalen Williams become the level of defender that Kawhi Leonard was, especially, prime Kawhi Leonard. That's a very high bar to sort of set there. But we are seeing just some tremendous stuff from him over really this season as a whole. He's not going to win it, but could probably make a very solid argument for most improved player as well. On the other side of this game, it was Jalen Brunson scoring 30. He had the couple of baskets and the free throw as well that gave the Knicks a chance at winning this one, but it was Shai Gilgeous-Alexander coming down the stretch and making the jumper with just 2 seconds left that ultimately gave the Thunder the win in this one. So a very nice performance from the Thunder as well, who, as we sort of head into the playoffs here, a lot of people have questions about them because of the youth, the lack of size, all of that, but they're an extremely hungry team. You see how composed they can be in some of these types of moments against playoff caliber teams. I know they're not scared of anyone. I would maybe be scared for them a little bit in certain matchups, but at the same time, I do believe that they are, within a year. If it's not this year, it's probably next year where they make the jump to be real contenders. But I guess quickly we'll rattle off a couple of these other games from last night. We saw Dallas and Houston. Really, I just wanted to point that out in connection to the Warriors coming away with a win against San Antonio, where we saw the Rockets just get obliterated by the Mavericks in this game, and Luka continues to try and make this late push for being an MVP candidate. 47 points, 12 rebounds, 7 assists in this one, leading the Mavericks to the blowout win. The Rockets had been on this hot winning streak. They just squeaked the game out against the Jazz on Friday, it was, I believe, or it was Saturday. I think it was Friday. But either way, the Rockets' win streak comes to an end here. They are 2 games out, with the Warriors also beating the Spurs last night. Tough break for them. And then finally, very quickly, on the Bulls and Timberwolves game from last night, I've sort of been saying the Timberwolves can stay afloat here with Karl Anthony Towns out from injury. Naz Reid is a very solid matchup as well for a lot of these teams, and I do like him a lot. But last night, especially in crunch time, as we've sort of seen from the Timberwolves all year, this was a situation where you do sort of have to worry at least a little bit about especially those late game minutes and the level of offensive creation that is on that starting roster. The Bulls really didn't give Jaden McDaniels any respect in this one in terms of having him be the one to hurt them down the stretch. and that did help them to pull away from this one. They won the game 109-101. Jaden McDaniels was just 3 of 10, 1 of 6 from 3. And, I mean, sneakily, the Bulls, I know that we just talked about the idea of Embiid and the 76ers. They should make the playoffs with Embiid playing 100%. But the Bulls are also a team that they're not scared of anyone. They have just about as much clutch experience as anybody in the NBA based off of all of their games getting into these close matchups. And I don't think the Bulls are going to go away easy. So we will see with that. But on that note, we are going to be taking our final break. And when we come back on the other end, going to finish off by sort of laying out this upcoming NBA playoffs. And I'm going to be seeding both the Eastern and Western conferences to arrange the most fun possible playoffs in the NBA. So stick with us and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our final segment of the day, which is going to be making the best possible NBA playoffs. This is based off of matchups, and the one qualifier for this is they did have to be conceivable. For example, the Celtics and Bucks could not, of course, play each other in the first round. So just sort of an over-the-top example there, but you'll see as we go on here. Starting in the Eastern Conference, and speaking of the Celtics, they are already locked into being the 1 seed, and I have them playing against the Miami Heat, a rematch of the Eastern Conference Finals. These teams have faced off in 3 of the last 4 Eastern Conference Finals. Definitely a lot of baggage in this matchup, and for me as a Celtics fan, I personally don't want to see this because I just want to see the Celtics win, and I do think that the Heat, despite how bad their offense has been at times during the regular season, could still come away with this. We just have seen the level of play that the Heat are able to take themselves up to surpass expectations during the playoffs, obviously most notably last year, but even in years past, you can probably make the argument that in 2020, while I definitely don't think the Celtics were ready to be, true finals winners, I still think that you can make an argument they were more talented than the Heat in that series. And then last year it was Caleb Martin coming alive and ultimately burning them in that one. So a lot of baggage in this matchup. Again, for me, as a Celtics fan, I don't want to see it, but also if you're the Celtics here and you consider yourselves to be championship contenders, you probably do sneaky want to play the Heat, or at least if you have a level of pride that an NBA Finals team should have, you should probably want to play the Heat in the first round to get that monkey off your back and to sort of assert yourselves, no, this is our conference, despite what the seedings may show. We need to knock off the team from the Eastern Conference, the Eastern Conference winners from last season. That's why I have Celtics versus Heat as the 1 versus 8. The 2 versus 7, I have the Bucks versus the 76ers. Giannis versus Embiid, 2 perennial MVP candidates facing off. Still a question of whether or not we're going to get a fully healthy Embiid. What percent of Embiid can we get in this matchup? But honestly, like I talked about in the second segment as well, I do think it's, understandable that the 76ers could possibly knock off the Bucks here. Outside of the top 2 players in this conference, with Giannis and Embiid being a little bit of a wash. 76ers, you can make an argument if you were to draft players from this series. I think Tyrese Maxey probably goes ahead of Damian Lillard. I think the likes of a Tobias Harris may go over Chris Middleton. Now, Chris Middleton's been playing well lately, and you do have to acknowledge that he has a history of in the postseason showing up. Definitely more to the level than Tobias Harris does, but I think that the coaching advantage probably goes to the 76ers with Nick Nurse as well. Would be a very interesting matchup in my eyes. 3 versus 6 seed in the East, I have the Knicks and the Orlando Magic. Listen, this might not be the most aesthetically appeasing game, or appealing, take your pick, but it might not be the prettiest game between these teams, but two defensive juggernauts that would be a little bit of a bloodbath, I think. Would be a different type of series than a lot of the high-scoring games we see in the NBA as things currently stand. But this and the 4-5 matchup of the Cavs and Pacers also sets up some really interesting potential second-round matchups, where the biggest reason for those is the Celtics potentially facing the Knicks in the second round, where you get a little bit of a rivalry series there, two historic franchises, and would be a little bit of a grudge match. Kristaps Porzingis versus the Knicks. Magic could also be a sneaky series for the Celtics as well. Also, if you have the Heat coming out of that Celtics-Heat matchup, you would have a rematch of the second round from last year with the Knicks and Heat, or a potential little Florida thing going on. I think all of the possibilities out of this one are a lot of fun. And on the other side of the Eastern Conference, maybe having a chance of the Milwaukee Bucks facing off against the Indiana Pacers to build off of that rivalry that we saw brewing earlier this year. There was the in-season tournament game that got a little bit chippy at times. The Pacers end up winning that game, and part of the aftermath of that was Adrian Griffin shortly getting fired after that because of some of the locker room interactions that took place after that loss. And then, of course, we had the game ball situation where Giannis was running around the court like a madman trying to track down the ball after he scored a franchise record 64 points, and Indiana had stolen the game ball because of the fact that Oscar Tshiebwe recorded his first ever official NBA points in that one. So another very interesting storyline that could come in the second round there. I do think the Pacers or Cavs could give the Bucks a series as well, and would be very interesting to see. For all of this to happen, the 1 through 6 seeds would stay the same, and it would be Philly beating Miami in the 7-8 game, and the Heat beating either Chicago or Atlanta, whoever comes out of the 9-10 matchup. If you want to sort of extend this exercise a little bit too, I think that the Bulls beating the Hawks would be a bigger... Bulls beating the Hawks would lead for a more entertaining game for that final playoff spot, as the Bulls actually had a lead against the Heat before the Heat became this juggernaut in the playoffs. They had the lead late in that game in the fourth quarter before the Heat came back, and then ultimately from that game catapulted themselves into the NBA Finals as well. So I do think this is a very possible outcome, and again, a lot of compelling second round matchups that could come of that as well. But looking at the Western Conference playoffs, I have the Nuggets versus the Lakers as the 1 versus 8 seed. Another rematch of the conference finals. Crazy how in both conferences we have a conceivable idea, and that's also because both the Heat and the Lakers last year came out of the play-in tournament as well. So, you know, you look at that series, sure, it was a sweep between the Nuggets and the Lakers, but it was probably the most entertaining sweep in NBA history, with every game going down to the wire, being entertaining, and ultimately it was the Nuggets coming out in that one. But that is what I would have for the 1 versus 8. 2 versus 7, I have the Thunder versus the Suns. A lot of hungry new players in the Thunder organization versus the established veterans in Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and the Suns. There isn't necessarily that dominant big man on the Suns that you do sort of worry about with the Thunder a little bit, as they have a lack of size outside of Chet Holmgren. Jalen Williams, the second one from Arkansas, not J-Dub, but he's actually been playing pretty well for them as well. But ultimately, a big dominating center could potentially threaten the Thunder's chances of being a team that advances to the second round, and I don't think that the Suns have that. I do think that these teams would be very evenly matched up. You have a little Shai Gilgeous-Alexander versus Devin Booker matchup from some of these new generation guards. Kevin Durant, in theory, would be the best player on the court. Probably would be, unless Shai has something to say about that. And then the 3 versus 6 matchup, I have the Timberwolves versus the Pelicans. Two physical teams. Injury status with Cat would definitely have to be monitored for this one because they lose the size without him. But both teams centered around a lot of youth talent, but feel like they are ready to compete. Anthony Edwards versus Zion Williamson, the back-to-back first overall picks in 2019 and 2020, and two potential candidates for the next face of the NBA. And then 4 versus 5 seed, Clippers versus Mavericks. Luka's revenge against the Clippers, where these teams faced off in 2019-20 and 2020-21. The Clippers won both times, most recently coming back from a 3-2 deficit to win. But Luka really put himself on the big stage with these series at the time, where he averaged 33.5 points per game, 9.5 assists, 8.8 rebounds on 49-39 shooting splits. I think that the 2019-20 series was probably the best playoff series we've seen from Kawhi Leonard in a Clippers jersey, where he averaged 32.8 points per game, 10.2 rebounds, 5.2 assists, and played tremendous defense throughout. Was an iconic matchup between these two teams and would be very fun to watch. These seedings would also set up a potential Battle of LA in the second round if it were to be the Lakers somehow pulling off the upset against the Nuggets and the Clippers coming out on top. But more likely it is Denver moving on to face either the Clippers or the Mavs. Both matchups would be interesting in my eyes, where the Clippers spent most of the year with the third best odds to win the championship, second best odds to come out of the Western Conference, and we just recently saw the Nuggets versus Mavericks game on St. Patrick's Day end with a classic and a Kyrie game winner with one of the most improbable shots that we have seen. So would be a ton of fun there. And then the other side of the West bracket would feature the possibility of the Suns versus a couple of different young matchups that would test them well in the Pelicans and the Timberwolves. Maybe we see the Suns come out on top of that as well. I think that that's probably the least entertaining of sort of the second round matchups that we've laid out, but could definitely still be fun. In order for this to all happen, the Nuggets would have to pass the Thunder for the 1 seed. They're currently 0.5 games back. The Suns would have to beat the Kings in the 7-8 game, and then the Lakers would have to beat, you would think, in theory, the Warriors, maybe the Rockets, if the Rockets can put together this improbable run and beat, and then the Lakers would have to beat the Kings as well to get to that 8 seed. I'd say this is definitely less likely than what I laid out in the East. The Nuggets are probably cool with coasting into the playoffs a little bit. Jamal Murray has missed the last 5 games with a knee injury. With his track record and just how important he is to the team, the Nuggets are slow playing his return a little bit here. And for the Nuggets, can't imagine they're all too worried about home court advantage in whatever series against either the Thunder or the Timberwolves where some younger teams that definitely are talented. But again, I just don't think that the Nuggets are really scared of either one of them. So we'll see. They're still 3-2 without Murray, so not bad, but we'll see whether or not they can overtake the Thunder for the 1 seed. And then the play-in is a little bit of a toss-up. I do think that there's a good chance that it could be the Suns and Lakers coming out in that order, but it would require Anthony Davis and the Lakers to beat Domantas Sabonis and the Kings. Sabonis notably has a 10-0 career record over Anthony Davis. That has been a storyline really coming into, it's gotten more spotlight this season, so we'll see about all of that. But I do feel like there's a lot of compelling storylines that could be taking place in the playoffs. We'll see which of them we get. But on that note, we are going to be, that's all we have time for today. We are going to be logging off here. We will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. And we will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.